My guest today is Glyn Thomas. He's an historian on ancient civilization and early Christianity. Glyn works to resolve historical enigmas and find out what really happened in our past. He's interested in how humanity evolved, its definition of a divine creator, and says there is proof to a Six Sigma standard that an incredible intelligence is responsible for the design of our universe. His research was done using astronomy, atomic physics, volcanology, terraforming, geology, biology, climatology, archaeology, and astro-archaeology. He applied these principles to understand the Bible when its books were written and why key edits were made and translation errors he feels were deliberately made to the Bible. His research led him to understand why some original texts were hunted down and destroyed after being declared heretical. And as a result, he says much of the history in the Bible is anachronistic or factually incorrect. My intention today is to keep an open mind in which promises to be an interesting and engaging conversation. This show is not intended to tell you what is true or what is not true. Rather, it's to encourage you to think differently and question everything so you can discover the truth for yourself. Welcome to my show, Glyn.
Thank you. It's a good introduction.
So, what got you started? Tell me about your background. What got you started doing research into ancient civilizations and history?
Right. Um, this will sound quite weird. When I was young, very young, I was very interested in cosmology and very ancient history. And once I started work, though, I was bogged down in professional reading. I had worked pretty long hours, and I had to read a lot of legal and accounting stuff, boring stuff. And I could never read what I would actually like to read for pleasure. Sometimes when I went through an airport, I'd see a new book and I'd think, oh, that looks interesting. I'd grab the book. All that happened, they just piled up on the side of my study. So when I
The thing
retired,
called work. Yeah, the thing called
yeah,
work. Yeah.
yeah. As I approached retirement, I would say to people who questioned me, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to lock myself in a library for 2 years. Didn't quite come to that, but
Well, at
I
least you
did
knew
start.
what you wanted to do. You knew what you wanted
Yeah,
to do. Yeah.
I was concerned that in retirement, I'd have a lot of time to spare. In fact, it's not worked out that way. I'm so busy, I cannot believe how I ever had time to go to work. But what I found, and I started reading what I wanted to read, was the way in which the knowledge of humanity has exploded whilst I was working. That's sort of 50 years. And the differences are stark. I can remember when I was young, the debate was around climate change. Our planet was about to enter a new ice age.
No, yeah.
That was the majority.
Don't get me started on that, Glenn. Yeah. I've been around the block on that one.
Right.
I wrote my senator in
Right.
Arizona, and he's like,
Wow.
"Yeah, the Earth is cooling." I'm like, "No, it's not." Yes, it is. Yeah, been there. Yeah.
Well, an even more stark one was that the majority view was that it was very likely that our star was the only one with planets. And this was proof of God's special blessing to humanity. We
Oh,
now know slightly.
did what happen is you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. The how, that's just too special. I either believe everything or I got to start questioning stuff. Is that what happened?
Yeah. And when I started reading, when I saw after my retirement, I was like a little kid in a candy store. But I did make little notes as I was reading, and my wife was complaining because my scribbles were building up and the books were building up. So I thought, I know a solution. I'll write a book. That would do two things. It'll force me to focus, and I can then get rid of all the scribbled notes. So I wrote my first book probably in about 2 or 3 weeks, but it then took me 3 or 4 months to go through verification to check the spellings, the dates, the places, the
Mm-hmm.
names, and everything. Because
Well, well,
my
what I just did a solo 10-minute episode on how to write your own book, and that's exactly what I tell people to do. Collect all your notes and just organize them.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just get the brain dump,
Mm-hmm.
which is flowing, and then polish it afterwards.
Yeah.
If you try
Yeah.
to perfect each page, you'll never get anywhere, in my view. But
Yeah.
and then uh, I found that what was driving me to write was the general reaction of media to anything that happens is they go to a specialist. And in many subjects, a specialist is a tenured professor.
Or
The
has a
only problem,
book, or has written a book.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, they got their professorship, their tenure, because they did something really good when they were young.
Mm.
But the two problems are one, that they want to defend their work. So something that comes up that rather demolishes their work, that's not
Yeah.
something they're going to support. And the other problem is, although they have immense depth in their subject tends to be very narrow, what I call chimneys of knowledge. They
Mm-hmm.
don't look outside. And what I was finding was that what I was doing was looking across disciplines on a
Mm-hmm.
particular issue. And that was, to me, I was discovering stuff that I wasn't reading anywhere else, but it's just like a mental snap. So you could see, that supports that, and that supports that. It's
Yeah, like
coherent.
so if it has to be true across all spectrums, otherwise somebody's got it wrong, and if someone has it wrong, then who has it right?
Equally, other things, when you looked into other disciplines, you thought, can't see that really happening. That's
Right.
not right.
It's not
So
possible under that model. It just doesn't, it's not going to work.
that's right. So it was the combination of those things that
So
got
where
me to
did you
write.
start? Where did you, this is a huge project to really, first you have to read everything that is written, like everything out there, and then you have to go, okay, that's not true, that's not true. How do I find out more? How'd you break it down and even get started? Seems overwhelming.
Well, where I suppose the way I approached it was the first driver was actually it was going back to church with my wife as a churchgoer, and it reawakened my concern about certainly parts of the Bible. And I focused initially on the Torah, the first five books of the Old Testament, which is supposed to be it's about five or six stories actually of key events.
Hmm.
And the more I read, I thought, well, this, you know, to cut a long story short, what has happened is very, very interesting. The way humanity has absorbed its knowledge. The the Israelites that were carted off to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar around 536 BC, he was interested in taking all the elite because he wanted the intelligentsia, the scribes, the architects, the builders to help him recreate the palaces and temples of the original Babylon that had been destroyed around 1,000 years earlier, but which they had all the plans to because they're all on these baked clay tablets. That the period that they were there, they were billeted in Nebuchadnezzar's library. So they were able to look at the ancient stories of how Babylon thought creation started and their history.
Hmm.
And that's why you see in Genesis sort of like two stories of everything. One, I think, was the oral story that had been handed down from Abraham down through the patriarchs, because Abraham was Sumerian. And the other version that they read in the books in Nebuchadnezzar's library, also in the original Sumerian language, but in these cuneiform tablets, would have given the original documented history. So the oral history obviously changed over, it sort of evolved slightly over.
It almost sounds like what happens today. People believe a different history word of mouth and just somehow are taught in school word of mouth versus what's in the filing cabinet historically somewhere.
Well, there's an amazing set of tablets. It's called the Seven Tablets of Creation. Um, People equate that to possibly where they got the idea of 7 days.
Hmm.
And in a sense, Genesis, as we've got it, looks like an executive summary of a much longer document, which
Hmm.
goes by the title Enuma Elish, which is just the first few words of the first of these tablets. So
So backing up,
that
I'm losing the story a little bit. Uh, Correct me as I try to summarize. The original Babylon destroyed, and somehow the records on how it was built and its history were kept, even though there were wars and someone kept those safe. Babylon rebuilt, and then uh, yeah, my history is not as good, I guess, is what I'm saying. Glenn is
sorry.
turned
I was
to
just
yeah.
referring, I was just explaining why, if you read Genesis, you might be surprised. There's a number of the key stories are repeated twice, slightly different versions.
Okay.
Um, so I think that's the reason, because they're from different sources. One was a written document, which was thousands of years old at the time Genesis was
Uh,
written,
Okay,
and the
so
other was an
the
oral memory.
the official version of Genesis is God created the universe in 7 days, right? Or 6 days, and there's a rest on the seventh.
But if you read it carefully, it might be referring just to Earth or even just to our solar system. It's
Hmm.
certainly not referring to the universe.
And what's the other version? Are you saying that is the correct or that's not completely correct?
No, that's why there's two slightly different versions in Genesis. One, I think, was copied from a original historical document
Hmm.
that the Hebrew priests found when they were in Nebuchadnezzar's library. It was the most popular document. They
What is
had,
this library? This Nebuchadnezzar's library. What is that? Tell me about that.
yeah, it's the library of the
Oh,
king's library. So it's the state's repository of important documents,
I see. And if you were a
including,
scholar, you could go there if you had permission from the king.
well, more than that, he actually put the architects that he brought from Jerusalem together with presumably his own architects and
Oh,
put them in, because what he
okay.
wanted was
Okay.
for them to study the ancient drawings or documents and then try and recreate some of these ancient palaces and wonders.
What happened? I'm sorry if I tangent, but I can't help but ask. Do you
Yeah,
know
please
what
do.
happened to the original palaces that were destroyed and how the plans were saved?
Well, is an incredibly old city. It was formed originally, it was founded about 2300 BC, originally as Dinga Ra, the gateway of Ra. And then around 1800, the name was changed to Babylon, meaning gateway of the gods. It was attacked by the Assyrians, I think, around 1400, and then it fell into disrepair. But it was always, because of its location, an important city. So it survived and grew again. And the period referred to as the Second Babylonian Empire uh, under the Chaldeans, that was the the line that Nebuchadnezzar was part of as a king.
I see.
But maybe we've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole there. But I was trying to explain how um, there's a more interesting aspect that has opened up a lot more information to me. The reason that the biblical history has been so pervasive in the Western world was due to the fact that originally it was the Catholic Church had a monopoly from around 300 AD to the Protestant Reformation, which really sort of 14th, 15th centuries. And over those 1200 years, they had a total monopoly. Indeed, most people went to church. There wasn't any
Hmm.
such thing as an atheist.
That is a long time, 1200
Yeah.
years. Dang.
And they could do things over that period.
Yeah.
So church attendance was nearly 100% within Christendom, which was basically Europe those days. Now, one interesting thing, and I think it was because they realized it would not be a good idea, the Catholic Church always prohibited lay members from reading the Bible.
Hmm.
Only, only the priest could read the Bible.
And they went, it was in
Ordinary,
Latin, right? They put it in Latin.
yeah, that didn't help, but it
Yeah.
was you could be excommunicated if you were caught reading the Bible
Wow.
because they didn't want people to look at it and ask questions. So when Europe entered the age of empire and the European powers started um, creating colonies all around the world, it was against a background where historically it was England had declared UDI from Rome under Henry VIII, primarily because he wanted to get more divorces than the Pope would allow. But he didn't want to change the religion. He wanted to be the head of an English Catholic Church. In fact, he was equally keen on burning heretics and people who translated the Bible into English, like William Tyndale was burnt at the stake in the same way that the Roman Church had ordered. It was only a little later that towards the end of his reign, he switched ideas and thought, yeah, well, as I'm head of the church in England, I ought to have a Bible in English. And the initial attempts were, it was quite a task in those days to try and translate a book that complicated and that long. So it was at the beginning of the 17th century, King James I was united with Scotland. I think 1603 to 1608, he pulled a committee together of all the bishops in the UK and commanded them to create what we know as the King James Version.
Hmm.
But the instructions are very, very interesting. They said, get the best original documents you can, which means don't use the Vulgate, because the reason it's called the Vulgate is that it is a vulgar translation. That's where the term Vulgate came from. And that applies to the official Catholic Bible, believe it or not.
So what is
So,
the what's is it vulgar? I think of as being offensive. What is this vulgar they
not
don't
so
want
much
them to use?
offensive as crude and inaccurate, but
Well,
that was the name they gave it. Slightly different meaning, vulgar in Latin, but that's why it was called the Vulgate by the church, not by the lay people, because they weren't allowed to read it. So,
and is this vulgar book actually have some truth to it?
uh, yeah, I mean, it was an attempt to translate the Greek into Latin. So it took the Septuagint. Now, this is confusing. The Septuagint sounds like a Latin name, but it's actually a Greek translation from Hebrew by Hebrew priests of the Old Testament. And it was done in Alexandria in Egypt around 200 BC, and it was adopted by the Christians to such an extent that the Jewish people then said, well, the Christians have taken that. We want a new translation. We don't want, a second-hand Greek. We want to go back to proper Hebrew.
So, Glenn,
So,
I think I lost a part of the story, which is we're translating the Bible. Who wrote the Bible originally, like back in Babylonian times?
well, I think, yeah, my view is that most of the Old Testament was written in Babylon. The oldest manuscripts that have been found tend to show that it was written in classical Hebrew, which was the Hebrew of Babylon. There was probably parts, some relatively small parts of the Old Testament that were written before that. But
And
the
and
idea
those would be the that would be the true story of the creation of who we are.
well, that would be the oldest parts of the Jewish scripture that we have. Because remember, there wasn't any, I mean, Hebrew didn't exist as a written language until around uh, around about the year 1000 BC, which is the signpost. That's supposed to be the year that David captured Jerusalem. You
But
remember
more or
the,
less the Bible, the books in the Bible, Genesis, at that time, Babylonian, would have been more authentic, that quote Bible.
well, yeah, in Hebrew, I don't think they were changed much,
Okay.
if at all, only scribal errors, but trying to date when it was written. But the effect of the English king's instruction to the bishops was to create an English language version based off the best Greek manuscripts. We have
Which,
thousands of ancient
so
Greek manuscripts.
for 1200 years, the truth was right there, just nobody could read it. As what the same books that we had in Babylon for 1200 years, they're floating around the Catholic
Well,
Church,
the
but no one could read them.
Babylonian stuff was the Old Testament, remember? The Greek stuff is the New Testament, because all the New Testament was originally written in
Mm.
Greek. So they took the Greek manuscripts and they took the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew version of the Old Testament that was written actually again in Babylon in the 8th and 9th centuries AD. So that's what was used. But the overriding and very interesting instruction by the king to the bishops was that if going back to the source documents, you find explanations or detail which contradicts our dogma, change the translation so it conforms with accepted dogma.
You're referring to Christianity.
Yeah. So a lot of the point of going back to the older, more original documents is lost because where they differed, they were instructed to change it so it agreed. Then, armed with that new Bible in English, the King James Version, when the British went out, built a huge global empire, they took missionaries with them and hundreds and thousands of copies of the King James Version. So everybody learned about Christianity and ancient history from the King James Version.
And
Now,
what's different in the King James, both New and Old Testament, and also with Jesus's teachings? Because I know you studied Jesus a lot. What's
yeah,
different
I
in
think
the?
that there are considerable differences between what I believe was Jesus' original teaching, and we've got documentary support for that, and what has ended up as the conventionally taught and biblically documented
And
version today.
what was the original? And then for those who aren't Catholic or
That's a that's a pretty big
uh,
thing. I mean, let me just give you 1 minute of the to finish off the King
okay,
James version,
okay.
because what that did, that was before we understood, we'd forgotten how to read cuneiform, we'd forgotten how to read hieroglyphics. So when the King James Version was distributed liberally across the Americas, South Asia, East Asia, Australia, people used that and thought it was a gospel version of ancient history, the history of the planet, the history of the Egyptians, and everything up to the Roman time, because we couldn't read anything before that. We could read Greek, but that was about it. Couldn't read Persian or any of the ancient stuff. So the fact that it was imperfect as a record of history, to put it very mildly, was completely lost. For 4 centuries, that was the gospel version of history. And
You
it was
never
only in the
questioned it. Like nobody questioned it. You thought
we
it was
didn't have any basis
yeah.
for questioning it because we couldn't understand hieroglyphs or cuneiform. But that was resolved by discoveries in 1805, the Rosetta Stone, and the Bechistan inscriptions in Iran, actually, in around 1860 something. That's transformed our knowledge because now we can read everything. And
Hmm.
the amount of stuff we have is utterly incredible. We have day books of Egyptian pharaohs that record what they did every day, how much tax was delivered to them each day. Amazing amount of detail. And what it shows is the biblical history, if you look at it as a history, understandably, because the guys in Babylon writing around 550 BC, they didn't have history books. They didn't have internet. They didn't have newspapers. So they had oral memory, and that was about it. So they just wrote a foundation story for their nation and to try and bind the people up to continue worshipping their God. So that humanity had adopted those writings as accurate history in the
What
absence of any other knowledge.
what for I grew up Catholic, by the way, so I know what Jesus is Catholic, but I'm not practicing, and I'm when I ask you questions, just to frame it how
Mm,
where I'm coming from a perspective, I know more about the Catholic than I know about some of the other
mm.
religions. What specifically would they change to make the Catholic religion more authentic? What would they need to change in history?
Well, that's a huge question. And amazingly, things are being discussed in the Curia even now. This month, I heard reports, amazing things. But let me take you back.
Or just one or two things would be,
Yeah. Well,
would be
let's just go with a few big ones.
okay,
So that
okay.
it seems that St. Paul, he started changing what Jesus had taught. If you read, and I'm just looking at the Bible as it is, if you read what's actually in today's Bible, in the Acts of the Apostles, it describes, I think, three occasions where the leaders of the original church that Jesus founded, the Nazarene church, called Paul back. So there'd be James, who was appointed as the leader, and probably I think Peter was there as well. They called Paul back and said, what is this you're teaching? This is not what the master taught. And it's actually described exactly in those words, I think,
Hmm.
in Acts, at least two, maybe three occasions. They don't actually say, you are teaching, da, 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 why are you teaching that? But the mere fact that they are challenging what Paul is
Oh, I
teaching,
see. It's not the what they were challenging, but the fact that it's documented that it's been
they
changed, which
were challenged.
and that
Yeah.
gets you wondering, like I just asked you, Glenn, like, okay, what was
Yeah.
changed and how much was changed and why was it changed? It
So
opens Pandora's box.
if you read the Gospels and you read Paul's letters,
Hmm.
a number of things jump out.
Hmm.
Just grace, salvation, resurrection. And they're sort of big issues. Yeah. Grace. Well, according to Paul, if you believed, um, you know, you would be saved.
Okay,
But
I'm
the
with you. Yep.
original view was that faith without works is pointless. It's not
Hmm.
just belief. You have to actually live your life
It's kind of like
following.
the movie The Secret or these manifestation experts. Just believe and you will be rich and happy and yet
Absolutely.
it's taken out of context. They don't tell you the I think they were afraid they wouldn't sell as many books if they told you, "Oh, part 2, you actually have to take action on your faith."
Yeah.
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 So Paul developed this idea that you didn't have to do anything, just you just get
Hmm.
grace.
Right.
And then the church thought, wow, this is a great idea. Basically, and you know this, that the idea is that Jesus' death created an unlimited amount of grace. But what the Catholic Church said was this was available to the Pope and only to the Pope. The
Hmm.
Pope could delegate it to other, um, uh,
By
what's it
grace, you
called?
mean power of some kind.
Well, the power to forgive, basically.
Oh.
So grace was distributed down through the sacred orders, down to the ordinary, your local priest, and he could give you a bit of grace. But the idea was that you had to, they then started to change it so that, okay, you had to, go to confession. And then in order to be forgiven, you could light a few candles or you could say a few prayers. And then somebody had a bright idea. And it's the most, the humanity's most amazing marketing coup. Said, why don't we sell it?
So
So
going
we
to
started,
confession or the rosary or what are we selling?
well, we're selling grace. So
Forgiveness
Um,
or forgiveness for your
yeah.
sins.
Well, the basic idea is that, you've got three kinds of sin. So you've got venal sins, which you can be forgiven by the church in confession.
It's starting to
Then
sound
you've
like
got,
a Monopoly game. No, all with all due respect to those religious people that are listening, and by the way, I was a Catholic schoolboy, so I get it. It's just starting to sound really contrived and like a derivative of the ancient text.
yeah. Well, then you've got the mortal ones, which the church cannot forgive. They'll be forgiven later
Hmm.
if you get there. And then you've got heresy.
So
Now, heresy is
back to Paul, his translation, the key thing, grace.
Mhm.
Your basic the key point is everybody had the power to ask God for forgiveness, but he put it in the hands of the Pope and the church specifically.
It wasn't Paul that did that. Paul said you didn't have to do anything, just
Mm.
believe.
Okay.
The church decided that it had an unlimited quantity under its sole control. It would distribute it as it felt fit. And then it started to think, well, actually, we charge for it. So that led to the whole concept of relics. If you went and gazed at a relic in a distant monastery or distant church, that was created a lot of economic value. You could collect like, you know, air miles or trading stamps
It's I'm
because every
smiling, Glenn, because it's just again, even as a Catholic, I'm like it's just I don't know what the words are for how yeah, anywho, go ahead. Yeah. Well,
even Martin Luther, the guy who was the one who's supposed to have really triggered the Protestant Reformation by nailing
hmm.
his theses on the doors of the cathedral in Worms.
Yeah.
He he was a bright young Catholic priest in seminary, and even in seminary, they weren't allowed to read the Bible. He got his own supply of candles, and he snuck into the library at night to
This
read
is
the
the
secret.
this is the English translated Bible
Oh,
or
this
the
is the
old Bible?
Vulgate. That would have been Vulgate in the seminary.
The old
This
Bible.
is a seminary in Germany
Okay.
in 1470s or something. So he was he was a very smart student. He's regarded as very promising, and he was asked to do a favor by the local bishop, and he was sent to Rome with a message and some papers or something. And when he was there, he had a few days before he could get an audience with the right person. And he went round a number of churches and things. And he then wrote back to his parents, "Oh, if I'd have known, it's so wonderful here in Rome. It's so amazing. I have seen so many relics. If you'd have come with me, all your sins would have been forgiven. You would go straight into heaven. No purgatory for you because you'd have seen, hundreds of thousands of days worth of purgatory would have been exempt for you because of what I've seen." And it was actually on that trip he then began to see the false grandeur and corruption and stuff, which then triggered him writing his thesis afterwards. But it's just an example of how huge the
So
business involved.
before I lose train of thought, because besides Christians, I know there are a lot of people who respect Jesus's teachings. Were you tell me what might be different? Tell me what the original Jesus teachings were. Let's keep that simple. What did
Right.
Jesus actually teach?
I have come to conclude, and I say that because I've made a study of the books that were declared heretical.
Hmm.
I identified about just over 100 of them that were listed at various church councils. These are big gatherings of bishops at regular times over the centuries. And one of the things they regularly did was identify books that had been marked as heretical.
You're going for
And
the meat, like you're making it easy for you to they're making it easy for you. You're going right for the stuff that's classified. You're not supposed to be able
yeah,
to read.
but it was until the last 50 years or so, we didn't have any copies of most of these books or any fragments. But a couple of caches of books were discovered, some in Egypt, some in other monasteries in Asia Minor, which have now given us texts which have been long, long lost. And these bring together my understanding that is quite revolutionary. Um, Going back before Jesus, the Jewish belief was that, and I think the branches of Judaism still do believe, that we humans contain a dual spiritual component. We have a soul and a spirit, the nephesh and the ruah. The spirit is believed to be of God, from God, and when we die, returns to God. But the soul is our own individual personality. It's our character, our memories, it's us. And the certainly the Hebrew belief was that at death, the soul is consigned to a deep, dark chasm in the earth, cut off forever from everything, even from God. So if you wanted to communicate with God or pray to God, you had to do it before you died, because afterwards it was lost forever. If you read very carefully, Peter and James both describe the period between crucifixion and resurrection. Jesus' soul left his body and went down to Sheol to give the good news to the souls of all the dead Israelites. Now, that is quite an interesting belief system, but the staggering thing is that the idea of a separate soul and spirit was widespread in the ancient world, certainly in Egypt, where they believed that it was difficult for the soul, but a good person doing the right things could succeed in saving their soul, transporting across the river Styx with the coins on the eyes and this sort of thing. And they read out a series of statements that they had only done good. And it's from those statements, actually, that the Ten Commandments might be traced, but that's a whole other story.
So
But there's,
if just so I don't so I'm staying with this your explanation, Glenn. Am I understanding this right? It's like they believed if you died, this is a way to reincarnate or keep your personality that you have
yeah,
and then transfer it into a new body or something like that. So you keep your soul, you don't return to spirit.
well, the two would be united because the spirit is believed to be our free will, our ability to actually act. So one is thoughts and one is action. It actually resembles very much the way psychologists today look at our brains, the left side and the right side, different skills, different functionality.
Oh,
But the
now
amazing thing,
I lost you now.
the two
Which,
halves of the brain,
yeah, I got that.
the right side and the left side, the way the
Lost. Yeah.
psychologists analyze the different functions is very similar to the idea of one side being all action orientated and the other one is the thoughts and memories. But the surprising thing is the extent to which the separation of spiritual, um, a spirit and a soul was common with the same kind of split in functionality right across Egypt, Sumer, and the
But the spirit is
Persian
not
Empire,
you're not meaning to
India,
say,
China.
you're not
So
meaning
this
to,
belief, yeah, sorry.
you're not meaning to say that spirit is thinking and soul is action or something like that. You're just
No, it's
using
the
it
other way
as a,
around. Yeah, the spirit is what drives action. I mean, theologically, that would be our free will, which is why the Jews thought it was of God, from God. It's part of the Godhead. It's a chip of the God's power devolved onto us as individuals.
the spirit is the thought and the soul is the action.
No, no, sorry, other way around. The spirit is your free will. It's your
Okay.
ability to do good things, but it's also your ability to do bad things.
Okay.
It's the definition of free will. You're free to do what you want.
Okay.
But with that comes responsibility. The responsibility is actually placed on the soul to seek to civilize and tame your wild, free spirit.
Hmm.
But the amazing thing is how this concept goes back into ancient cultures, the same concept. Now, to me, it's very strange. Firstly, it's not the kind of sophisticated belief system that you would ascribe to hunter-gatherers.
No,
You know,
I'm not. I don't believe
and
the whole hunter-gatherer evolution history of humanity at all.
right,
That's just childish in my opinion. I mean, it's
yeah.
okay to think, have an idea, but to
Hmm.
say this is a fact and I can prove it, I think we find things all the time, fossils dug up in, things archaeologists find that hunters and gatherers, we didn't evolve from apes, basically.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not real clear on this. It's fascinating the idea of the spirit, which is is that what people call source energy? Some healers they would call it
Could
source,
be.
the
Yeah.
spirit. And
Hmm.
then the soul is your individuality, right? And I'm not clear on when you say one has thought and one has action, how the ancients thought that worked.
Well, that's just a one-word label to describe the key groups of functionalities of the two parts. But what interested me was the idea that whole cultures, firstly, had thought, right, it's not just a person, but the person contains a spiritual component of two types. That is quite sophisticated, and it was common to many ancient societies. Now, when you combine that with some other conclusions I come to from studying all of these heretical books, you deduce that actually, when a lot of Jesus's statements were to some extent a riddle or had meaning at two levels. Again, in the Bible we have, there are many references where Jesus meets after he's given a sermon or something, and his disciples say to him, "Can you explain that? What are you talking about?" And he actually says sometimes, "Oh, you know, it's not for everyone to hear and understand." And you think, "Huh? Why? What's that?" But um, he some of his riddles he would always say, "I'm a son of man, but you lot that I'm talking to, you're born of women." And you think, well, that's a bit sexist. What does that really mean? Apparently, what he was meaning, and I think some plausibility to it, is that he had been born united. His spirit and soul were united as one. And that meant he could remember prior existences,
Mm.
whereas others he was talking to that were born of women were disunited. And his key message was that the purpose of incarnation is to bring together. That's why when you're born, you're united. And he said, suffer the little children, the innocent children to come to me because they hadn't sinned. They're still united. But as we live our lives, we do many things at varying degrees of seriousness of sin, and it drives our soul and spirit apart. So that when we die physically, the spiritual component leaves, and you can tell that just by plugging an electric current through a body. There's a current in all of us now. When we are clinically dead, it's gone. Well, what is it? That electrical charge could be our spiritual component. But after leaving the body, the soul and spirit separate, or at least the soul is turned off and is lost to memories. So that is described again in the Bible as the second death. And the key point theologically of our life on earth is to learn how to unite that enables us to avoid the second death.
So put that in
Now,
plain English.
I was trying
Uh,
to.
well, it's
Uh,
mostly the every time I say spirit, I try to get a definition in my head again. What am I looking and how does it look, feel? And soul, how does it look, feel? Because they're so closely related to me in terms of the words spirit and soul. So I'm just going to speak and you tell me stop. That's not quite it. What you've what you think you've discovered the ancients practiced and believed was we have this the spirit is the source energy. That's the God.
it's our free will. It's our
That
ability to do good and evil.
free will. And the soul is our personality in this lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we were able to really get it all together, we would be able to keep our personality or go from personality to personality
We
uh,
would retain it and it would be accessible to our consciousness. That's
as
why,
but
that's
then
why,
we'd get you mean when I get a new life, go into a new body, I would remember who I was before.
yeah.
And
Now, once you start to take this on board, all sorts of things start to become a lot clearer from statements that Jesus made that are recorded in the Gospels. So when he said, "I and my Father am one," and he said to the Sanhedrin, "You need two witnesses to prove something against
mhm.
somebody. You have two. You have me and my Father." Because for him, I think his father or his dominant prior life was alive in his head. So
By
there was like
father,
two
by
people
father,
alive in
you
his
by father, you don't mean literally father. You what did you mean? What does father mean?
prior existence.
Prior
There's actually,
existence.
yeah, if you go through the Gospels carefully, even in the versions we've got them, there's absolutely nothing that suggests Jesus claimed to be God or that he believed his father was God.
Yep.
Now that's pretty revolutionary, but
Yeah, I think so. He was trying to basically teach us something that had nothing to do with the religion as we know it.
yeah, if we could sum it up in one word, love. Because the way to unite the soul and spirit is by showing love to everybody.
I would agree with that. I'm not sure how does that. I'm still trying to get a picture of spirit versus soul. And if I work this, say we loved each other. Okay, you're Glenn, I'm Daniel. Yeah, yeah, let's do this. Let's pretend. You're Glenn, I'm Daniel, and there's love in the world somehow, peace. Then I'd then what happens when I die?
Well, you've got to do it to everybody, I think. But the important thing is before you die, if you reach this state, almost like nirvana,
Hmm.
then you can enter the kingdom of heaven immediately. You don't have to die.
I'm not okay
Remember
though.
when,
So break that down, Glenn.
right,
What did
when
you just
Jesus
mean by that?
started, when he started preaching in Galilee, right at the beginning, he was saying to people, you don't need to go and look for the kingdom of heaven. It's all around you. It's here. It's arrived. The way to enter it is to follow my teaching.
The love, like love each other.
If you love everybody, then you unify, and you in that state, you then enter the kingdom of heaven,
And
which I think
then
is more a state of mind.
okay, that's what I'm getting at, Glenn. When there's peace on earth, as the saying goes, what would happen to your body physically?
Right.
How
Now,
would things,
the point. Jesus was very clear on many occasions, even in the Gospels, let alone heretical books. The body is short, temporary, pointless, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. It was Paul who invented the idea of bodily resurrection, or at least he copied it from the Persians.
okay, so I would still die because my body is still
Yeah, the body's
physical.
worthless. But what it means is you avoid the second death. So your spirit and your soul are both united and alive. Now,
So,
maybe you come back in a different body, maybe you don't. Maybe you go on a different planet in a different body. Who
mhm.
knows? Jesus didn't tell us that.
Oh, I see. So I would die physically, and if
Yeah.
you're still alive as Glenn, you would see a dead body,
Yeah.
and my consciousness, my soul would not be destroyed.
It would be unified. Yeah.
By
Rise
unif
towards light.
it would what?
Rise towards the light. That's what people say when they go into the
Yeah,
next
isn't it?
state.
That's a really common belief, though, especially in Christianity. Go to the light.
Yeah.
So that part's congruent with the beliefs that people believe about the Bible, right? Go to the
Hmm.
light and you'll go to heaven.
If you like, I can give you like 2 minutes on bodily resurrection and where that came from,
Sure.
because the Jewish belief was always that the body is irrelevant. It's the spiritual component that's important.
Hmm.
And it was only, well, the Persians had this idea of bodily resurrection. The Persians ruled um, Israel from about 536 to 333 BC. That's when Alexander the Great died
Hmm.
after having demolished the Persian Empire. On his death, uh, Alexander's empire was split between four different generals. And the general that inherited Syria and Lebanon and Israel and my area was a bit of a fanatical character. And they wanted to really impose Greek culture. Many Jews actually thought Greek culture was very progressive and very good. Others preferred their own culture and wanted to preserve that. Well, the big sticking point was actually circumcision. And in the books of Maccabee, one Maccabees and two Maccabees, which are in the Apocrypha in the Catholic Bible, but they're not actually in the Protestant Bibles, it describes a period between about 190 BC to about 165 BC, which was a really terrible period of huge civil disorder. The ruling Greeks had decided to, Jewish eyes, they contaminated the temple. They put idols in there. They had, unprompted.
So Glenn,
Lives.
with who? So I'm still trying to get a picture of. There's love on the planet, so we all go to whatever the word is, nirvana or the light. It seems like the people causing the mayhem and the violence are in conflict with that. And they're either going to the bad place, not going to make the transition, or are they not even from this, are they maybe not human? They're trying to mess with the humans. I'm just trying to process why we even have evil then. If these people that had the original text know the truth, why would they even try to cause this kind of disruption?
But I think the way the Roman emperors adopted Christianity was nothing to do with theology. It was for political control. Emperor Constantine, within the around 325, called together all the Christian bishops. His He was already head of his own religion, um, Sol Invictus. He was the high priest of that as well. In the old days, if you were king, you were generally high priest as well, because you could control, that's how you controlled the people and their loyalty. So Constantine saw that despite the persecution of the Christians from time to time, they were quite persistent, but they actually did a lot of good because they looked after the poor and the sick. And the Romans' main strategy was to maximize commerce and trade and the economic growth so they could collect a lot of taxes to support the vast army that they maintained. So people who helped that were basically in the emperor's good books. So he thought, this lot, they're all arguing and squabbling about the definition of this and the definition of that. What they need is a bit of Roman organization. So I'll come in and I'll head up the church and merge it with mine, which is why certain things were changed, like Jesus's birthday, no meat on Fridays, and a few of the old Sol Invictus type ideas. And in fact, the Vatican is built over the main temple of Sol Invictus in Rome. It just shows that the two were merged. And of course, the emperor, one of the titles of the emperor was Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest. So the Catholic Church was ruled by the Roman emperor for centuries, which is why the Pope is often referred to as the Bishop of Rome, is just one of the bishops. So it puts a different complexion on things. So what Constantine wanted was a control mechanism, and within it's 381, so only 65 years later, or something like that, another emperor, Theodosius I, he codified Roman law. The Romans hadn't had a codification of law for about 500 years, so they had lots of overlapping laws. So Theodosius did this great piece of work to create, I think, 5 books of Roman law. Book 1 was ecclesiastical law, church law. Book 2, civil law. Book 3, property law. Book 4, criminal law, whatever. Ecclesiastical law meant that if you then said, well, Mary wasn't a virgin, you're now breaking the law.
Because you're going in
So,
against you're saying something's not true. You're
yeah,
challenging authority.
you're
But Glenn,
challenging
this
dogma.
but my main question was why don't those in authority design and teach love like Jesus if they knew the truth? Why aren't they teaching the truth?
Well, a lot of the people that knew the original truth were they were all massacred. There were 2 Roman genocides in Israel. One was
And
six.
who has to benefit from killing the bird that's bringing the message, the killing the messenger, except someone who's not in a loving enough state. They're in fear. They want to maintain control. They're not there yet. They're screwing up the system for all of this, is what I'm getting at, instead of helping us.
No, it's a huge tragedy. I mean, one could postulate that something we haven't covered, but from what I've looked at, I think it's extremely possible that Jesus had visited us before. When I say before, it could be like 12,000 years earlier,
Hmm.
which
And it
led
did, yeah.
which led to this sophisticated belief across all of the ancient cultures. Then there were events that wiped out the early civilizations. And in fact, there's hard physical evidence now, which
Those are
I think,
the meteors and Noah's
yeah,
Ark and everything else that you speak
yeah.
about. Yeah.
So humanity was reduced by that to back to the sort of hunter-gatherer stage, because those events would have created nuclear winters.
Yeah, that's
No
where the
sunlight
hunters,
for
that's where
years.
hunter-gatherers, the picture of hunter-gatherers really is appropriate because if your house got bombed and wiped out, you'd be out in the woods foraging for food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the trouble with those events was that without sunlight for, say, 3 or 5 years, vegetation didn't grow.
Mm.
So food would be pretty scarce. 99% of people would have died.
Now
That's a very, very high percentage.
here's a historical question for you. I don't know if you know the answer or not. Besides natural disasters, is it possible that someone, entity that didn't like that Jesus's teachings were being adopted and civilization was advancing, might have decided, you know what, they're making too much progress. I'm going to wipe them out. Do you find anything like that in your history, in your
I certainly
research?
haven't come across any evidence for that.
Okay.
Um, I think, to the contrary, it's difficult to find any clear evidence of any divine intervention in the physical world at
Hmm.
all.
Hmm.
We now understand how our entire universe has evolved, planets, life forms, species, and we've modeled it. So we're pretty confident of exactly how that's developed.
Hmm.
The divine aspect is actually in the underlying physical laws and the design of how everything works in terms of, sort of radiation and atomic physics. Once you dive into that and you look at the equations and the numerical constants, there you see, I believe, the fingerprints of God.
Yeah,
That is definitely
you have a statement that the proof of the existence of a God, at least as an ultimate designer, lies in atomic physics. Tell me about that.
right. I'm not the one who's, I mean, all of my stuff is not, or some of it is my own deduction of different people's work, but other people have done a lot of work to look at the fundamental aspects of physics and concluded that there's a divine hand behind the design. Einstein, Spinoza, some pretty important characters have come to
Hmm.
that conclusion. What I'm referring to is people have looked at various key formulae. So, for example, how a star forms. Um, the electrical force within an atom that attracts and repels protons and electrons is far, far greater than the force of gravity that will pull the atoms together to form a star.
Hmm.
Ratio of the power is stunning. It's 10 to the power 36. So that's the ratio between the force of gravity and the force keeping an atom together is 1 to 10 to the power 36. So that's 1 followed by 36 zeros. So 1 is so weak, but 1 is aggregate and 1 counteracts. So with that ratio, it brings atoms together, and then when there's enough together, it crushes the ones in the center to fuse. And basically, all stars are fusion reactions, fusion reactors, burning hydrogen to create helium. Now,
Well, it depends on who
if
you ask, actually. There's a argument that the sun's electrical, not fusion, too.
yeah, people come up with all
Yeah.
sorts of ideas, but I think that's
Which which
difficult
um
to say.
which we'll come back to it, but after you finish what you were speaking of. But I also wanted you to tell me before I forget, tell listeners how you did your research so they can do it in terms of do you have to know these ancient languages and how to read text and so they can kind of
Right, not at
follow
all.
so they can follow you down your rabbit hole. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I'll drop that down. I'll come back to that. So
Okay.
just imagine with that 10 to the power 36, it's created a star like ours, which has an estimated life of about 10 billion years. Now, if you knock off 1 zero, that's only 10 to the power 35, the size of star and the longevity of the star will be 90% smaller as a power of 10. So the star, just crudely, might last 1 billion years. Now, it took us nearly 4 billion years to have any recognizable life forms on this planet. So if a typical star only had a life of 1 billion years, life would never emerge anywhere. And that's one thing. To give you a second example, because these are difficult to explain simply. The second key number is nuclear efficiency, which is called epsilon. How much energy of the total energy potential of an atom is consumed when two hydrogen atoms fuse into a helium atom? It's 7,000th of 1%. Now, the stunning thing is, if it consumed 6,000ths of 1%, helium could never be formed. If it required 8,000ths of 1% of the energy potential, then hydrogen atoms would never be formed. And
So
matter would,
basically what you're getting at is there's in atomic physics there's a lot of things that this can't be by accident. There has to be some designer
precision
behind
is
it. Precision, yeah,
unbelievable.
I agree with that. in terms of your research, what is volcanology?
The study of volcanoes.
Oh, cool. You've been been around the block with your studies.
Well, there's two things that are bad news, or three things that are potentially bad news for us. A supernova going off too close,
Mm-hmm.
by too close, like 10 million light years away, that gives us so much radiation, we're just fried. Everything's fried. But the more frequent and deathly events will be a megavolcano or a
Yeah.
big meteor.
And what's terraforming?
The way in which climate creates a habitable environment.
Okay. And what about astroarchaeology?
Yeah, this is very, very interesting because what people have realized, and actually we've started doing it, I say we,
Yeah.
modern man has started doing it, you can you can design a building with a time lock that dates when it was built. I mean, an easy one, which some of your listeners may have been intrigued by, is the dating for the two pyramids and the Sphinx at Giza, which astro-archaeologists identify as a time lock to the helical rising of Leo, or sorry, Regulus, which is the key star in the
Mm-hmm.
constellation Leo,
Yeah.
which the physical ground positioning of the two pyramids, the two big pyramids, and the Sphinx acts to show that the conventional way that all temples were constructed in the old world was to align with the spring equinox. So as the helical rising of the main star in a constellation was usually key. Now, because the Earth's orbit is not perfectly circular, and because we have a tilt that gives us seasons, and worse than that, we're still ringing like a bell from an event that occurred when we were probably only, say, 50 million years old as a planet. Something very big hit us and ejected the material that became our moon on the far side of our planet. But as a result, our planet is shaking like
This
this.
is the astroarchaeology study
Uh,
or
th-
our
this
topic.
is how we can date things. So
Mm.
what happens? Our polar axis is shaking, and it creates what's called the nutation cycle, moving around, and that can be monitored and tracked. I mean, with computers, we can run
Mm-hmm.
it backwards. So we can look at the alignment of the material on the ground, and then see what the stars should have been were when that
Oh, I
was
see.
built.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
run the computer
Okay.
program, and it
Yeah.
says it was dedicated in that year.
I
Now,
get it.
the
Yeah.
dates do repeat. They repeat as we go through what's called precession. We're just switching from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. Precession goes backwards, but point the detail. So that
So
means at least
for those do you do Glenn, do you do most of your research or 50-50 like internet versus library like for those who want to actually dive into this?
it's
You have
nowadays it's so easy, so many documents are on the internet that you can access. If I
okay.
can't get it on the internet, then you have to pay for it, and then you can get it on the internet. Very rarely do I go to a library for stuff.
That was my big question. Are there any printed books that you actually you need to go to the reserve section in the library to really do your research, or you feel like it's all on the internet?
You could do what I try and do actually is you mentioned rabbit holes. Sometimes I wake up and I see lots of little doors, and I sort of think, oh, that one's open. I'll go in there.
Mm-hmm.
That one's locked. I won't, sort of thing. And
Yeah.
then I find you just go researching, and it leads to the most amazing places.
So
What
what's
my
next?
books
Yeah.
what I try and do in my books whenever I'm quoting things is say the sources. So people, I'll just quote enough for the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
somebody wants to research around it, I've got big bibliographies so they can dive
That
in and
is
go much.
really helpful. That is really helpful. It saves a lot of time and people can jump right to it and see what context you took something from and make their own rabbit hole, go down their own way of thinking. what's next for you in your research? What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm actually having a year off, more or less,
Hmm.
to try and learn a language. But
Hmm.
I'm part of a small theological discussion group, and I'm very fortunate to have an Italian in that group. Is now resident in Hong Kong, but he grew up in Italy. Exclusively taught at Jesuit-run schools. Actually, it was very interesting. And he never saw a Bible until he was 30 something, and his girlfriend had one in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
And he was a bit nervous about picking it up, but he did, and then he started reading it, and it was amazing.
He's
But
gone down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, certainly Protestants will be astonished at the idea of not reading the Bible, and certainly of not being allowed to read the Bible. In fact, many of my friends, I've got quite a few friends who, uh, I mean, Catholics or lapsed Catholics, who even now will shy away from looking at a Bible. Although,
I can tell you for myself, the reason is every time I have opened it, I get confused. And I think that's because intuitively, as we've spoken about, there are so many skips and jumps and deliberate mistranslations, so it's not true, and things taken out of context that it's like you're trying to follow a story, reading a novel, and it's like the author's a bad author, and it's a poorly written book technically, and I put it down because I'm like, I don't get it. Oh, you need to go talk to the priest. He'll explain it. Yeah, that's for me why I can't read the whole thing all the way through.
yeah,
So
understood.
so real quick, to plug your book, your
Thank
books.
you.
It's the Truth Will Set You Free series, right? Glyn
Mhm.
Thomas, you have an author page on Amazon.com. Do you have anywhere else you want to send people to besides your Amazon author page?
Well, my website is worth looking at. It's quintologypublications.com.
Oh, okay. I thought that was another publishing company. I have that for the show notes, quintologypublications.com. That will be in the show notes. Yeah.
It gives a lot of background to and details of each of the books. In particular, it gives the full index as well as the sort of chapters and so forth. So people can see what kind of material is covered in each book.
Nice.
Plus, when I was doing research, I wanted to illustrate and give maps of things. And I found I couldn't find maps that contained the information that I was wanting to show. So I had to commission my own maps to be made. Um, and what I've tried to do is superimpose the location of ancient cities and territories and battles, whatever, over modern political boundaries.
Hmm.
So, for example, you don't rarely see any indication that Babylon is now Baghdad
Oh, I
or
didn't know. Oh,
Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, is a suburb of Mosul, where
oh,
that's what's in northern Iraq. So
nice.
that I think is quite interesting, and also
Hmm.
particularly for educators, teachers, and so forth. So there's various documents, maps, and stuff which can be downloaded from my website. It's helpful for people.
I think your time off will probably be good. You probably get all these ideas, more scraps of bits and paper, like, and you come back and
Yeah,
write another book with it, right? Questions to
yeah.
ask that come up. Is there any thing else you want to add we haven't talked about? This is pretty deep, heavy, stuff to process. I don't know how much listeners could do in one anymore, but like one
I
thing,
think
like I wish I'd said this. Yeah.
I could talk until tomorrow,
Yeah.
but I think for listeners who are intrigued, it's probably best to start with my prequel. As the name implies, it wasn't the first written. So I thought it was a sort of Hollywood-esque type of way of putting one at the beginning of the series.
Right.
So this one is actually hardly got any theology in it at all, but is looking at the events that I think destroyed promising human civilizations
Hmm.
around 10,000 years ago,
Oh,
from which have we've got some legacy artifacts which we can't fit into our conventional view of history.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
like
Yeah.
Graham Hancock, you may have seen his Netflix series called Ancient Apocalypse.
Mm-mm.
He's done a lot of work on megalithic sites, usually called temples,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. Everything was wiped out, but doesn't know what caused the wipeout.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think I have found the evidence of exactly what happened that led to, nuclear winters, which wiped out those civilizations.
Those are the meteors.
Yeah. One of them, the second one in the Mediterranean, hasn't been dated yet. There's a fascinating piece of work being done. An Australian geologist had a brilliant idea. If you look at the surface of Mars and the Moon, they're covered in craters. So logically, our planet was covered in craters, or
Ah,
would have been. We didn't
right.
have weather, farming, 75% of the planet covered in sea. We would also have hundreds of craters visible.
Mm-hmm.
But he postulated that a lot more craters could be found under the sea because they're less likely to have been disturbed,
Oh, yeah.
and also came up with a brilliant way of finding and dating them.
Mm.
Because when a meteor hits, I mean, it's coming in, they'll be coming in at least 15 to 18 kilometers per second. So it doesn't matter how deep the sea is, it might be 1 second or 2 seconds, that's it, done. But
Yeah.
the impact is huge from a big one, obviously,
Yep.
and it creates a tsunami. So a lot of the material, when a meteor hits, the temperatures of the impact can be at least 3,000 centigrade. Now that liquefies most metal, let alone stone. So it also creates it creates compounds that are unique to those circumstances. They're not created by anything else occurring naturally on Earth. So if you then get a tsunami driven by that impact displacement, it carries some of this material with it in all directions.
Mm.
When it approaches the continent, starts to rise, slows down, and having reached land, will start to deposit some of the material, the residue, stuff, mainly sand, in these sort of crescent-shaped dunes. And what this guy did was examine meticulously the coastlines of East Africa, India, and Northern Australia. And he found lots of these typical crescent-shaped sand dunes. And because it's created by a tsunami, these dunes are all aligned to the impact point. So you basically draw a line back from each of the crescent shapes, and where they converge, X marks a spot for the impact.
Mm-hmm.
The first time they did this, they found one under 4 kilometers of water in the Indian Ocean,
Mm.
25 kilometers wide.
Interesting.
And
Well,
from the
that's
nano
cool.
diamonds and stuff
Yeah.
in the dunes, they're able to date it.
Yeah, and then meanwhile we have to go to we have to go to work on Monday. Yeah.
Right.
And makes you and then we come back on the weekends and do our research and try to figure out what really happened. Or like you say, there's some good shows on documentaries to watch in your books. Your books look fascinating. So they'll be in the show notes. Thanks, Glenn. It's been wonderful. Good talk. Interesting stuff.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah. Take
That's
care.
good. And you. And if you need any follow-ups, don't hesitate. Email or we can have another chat.
I'm going to encourage listeners to put questions in the show notes and absolutely hit us
Right.
up with all your questions or oh, how does that work? Or if you don't, if you're questioning stuff and you can logically explain why you're questioning, that's great because I'm sure I could pass those on to Glenn and connect you
Yeah.
with Glenn and he could answer them or refer you to one of his
Great.
books or a text. It's great. Just
Thank you
basically
very much,
keep
Daniel.
thinking. Yeah, question
Yeah.
everything.
You
Thanks, Glenn.
have a great weekend.
You too.
Cheers. Bye now. Bye-bye.